Thank you all for coming. I first want to start by expressing my condolences to Deputy Philip Campus, an officer who was selfishly serving his community in Kern County, who was killed in the line of duty on Sunday. He is a father, a husband, a Kern County Sheriff officer, and a former Marine. 3 others were shot in the standoff as well. Our prayers are with his family and those who were wounded as they continue to break through this. Each of us are indebted to our brave Capitol Police officers who come every day to this house prepared to defend us. On January 6th, these brave officers were put into a vulnerable and impossible position because of the leadership at the top has failed. December 14th, the leadership knew there was a problem. Even prior to that, Inspector General report told us there was failed leadership at the top of the police for the training. Rodney Davis will speak in a moment of a bill that he had to make sure the structure of the Capitol Police would change. We had many failures within the leadership. You had a chair of House administration with responsibility that did not come to the Capitol for more than 6 months. First time showing back up on January 3rd to vote for the Speaker. No hearings about the IG report. No movement of Rodney Davis's bill. There's questions into the leadership within the structure of the Speaker's office, where they denied the ability to bring the National Guard here. We now have a committee that all of America wants to know the answers to. Why were we ill prepared for that day, and how can we make sure that it will never happen again? But unfortunately, Speaker Pelosi will only pick on people onto the committee that will ask the questions she wants asked. That becomes a failed committee and a failed report, a sham that no one can believe. If you want the true answers, do not be afraid of the questions that will get asked. And drive the evidence to wherever it comes forward. We owe it to the officers, we owe it to the nation, to have an open and fair debate with all questions being asked. Again, the Republicans want to participate with the Republicans that are able to be on the committee, that have jurisdiction, have the knowledge, and the ability to ask the tough questions that can get the right answers. It's unfortunate we start with a committee chair who will tell you everything's on the table except the Speaker's office. How can you ever get to the bottom of the questions? How can you ever get to the solutions to make sure the Capitol is never put in this position again? From December 14th, they knew. The last time there was a break in the line was during the Kavanaugh hearings. Why weren't changes made then? Why weren't action taken after the IG report? There's a lot of questions that could get asked today to make sure these officers will never be put in this position. January 6th should have never happened. We should have prepared and be prepared for the officers, make sure they had the training and the equipment that they needed. With that, I'd like to call up our whip, Steve Scalise.
Thank you, Kevin, and I share those same sentiments. Our prayers go out to so many law enforcement officers who lost their lives in the last year. And every day, we thank those Capitol Police officers who risk their lives to keep us safe and to keep this Capitol hopefully open again to tourists who can come to the Capitol to see their government in action. But what we're here to talk about today is Speaker Pelosi's constant attempt to cover up facts that she doesn't want out there. You know, for weeks now, Jim Jordan and Jim Banks have been raising some very tough questions that need to be answered about why Speaker Pelosi didn't make sure that Capitol Police had all the tools they needed to be prepared for that day. Now, maybe because they were raising those questions, they got canceled by this new cancel culture that we see moving throughout the country, led by Speaker Pelosi and a lot of our socialist allies here in Congress, where they want to shut out voices that raise tough questions that they don't want to be asked or answered. And yet, they were starting to raise those questions about why the Capitol Police didn't have the tools they needed. What kind of intelligence did Speaker Pelosi get early off, weeks in advance, as Leader McCarthy talked about, that gave telltale signals that could have prevented what happened on January 6th? But Speaker Pelosi said that she doesn't want those questions asked, so she kicked them off the committee. She took an unprecedented step of refusing to allow members to be appointed by the minority leader to a select committee. Had never before happened in the history of Congress. And so as we see these kind of actions taken by Speaker Pelosi to cover up the facts that she doesn't want out there, it has completely debased the legitimacy of this commission, because clearly they're not searching for the truth. They're searching to get a narrative out that Speaker Pelosi has already written. And anybody that's going to ask questions that go against that, she just has them removed so that they can't bring those questions up. That's not an investigative panel. People know that. We've seen other bodies. The Senate's done some investigative work. The Department of Justice has done some investigative work. And it should be about following the facts, not about trying to cover up facts that tell a story differently than the one she maybe has already had written, and she just wants to now get others to back it up. So it's unfortunate that she's done it, because clearly it can't be about people who voted against certifying electors, because she appointed members herself who voted against certifying electors on January 6th, against them on January 6th of 2005, some of her own members who objected on January 6th of 2017. So clearly that's not what it's about. It's probably more about some of the tough questions that were already being raised by Jim Jordan and Jim Banks. And that's a shame, because those questions need to be asked and answered as well. And now they're not, because of the cover-up that Speaker Pelosi's continued to do. We see this with COVID. She won't hold a hearing on the origins of COVID. Too often we've seen this pattern by Speaker Pelosi of trying to cover up a narrative that she doesn't want out there, when we should be trying to get all of the facts. Now to come up next is our conference chair, Elise Stefanik.
There is a reason that Nancy Pelosi is the most disliked elected official in America. She always puts her own partisan politics over what's best for the American people. She's an authoritarian who has broken the people's house. She is a lame duck speaker, and everyone knows it. The reason why Nancy Pelosi is refusing to seat accomplished and well-respected hardworking Republicans like Jim Jordan and Jim Banks is because she doesn't want the American people to know the truth or learn the facts. She doesn't want a fair or bipartisan investigation. She wants a political one. It is a fact that in December of 2020, Nancy Pelosi was made aware of potential security threats to the Capitol, and she failed to act. It is a fact that the U.S. Capitol Police raised concerns, and rather than providing them with the support and resources they needed and they deserved, she prioritized her partisan political optics over their safety. The American people deserve to know the truth that Nancy Pelosi bears responsibility as Speaker of the House for the tragedy that occurred on January 6th. And it was only after Republicans started asking these important questions that she refused to seat them. House Republicans will continue to follow the truth and the facts and support our law enforcement officers to make sure this never happens again in the U.S. Capitol, the People's House. And I'm proud to turn it over to my colleague, very well-respected member, Jim Banks.
Today we will hear tragic stories by Capitol Police officers, tragic events that should have never happened at this Capitol building on January 6th, tragic events that happened on Speaker Nancy Pelosi's watch. It's clear at this point that Nancy Pelosi has cherry-picked the members to serve on this committee. She's pre-written a narrative. Only members who will stick to her talking points are allowed to serve on this committee. If this is truly a fact-finding mission to make sure that January 6th never happens again. This isn't what that looks like. Today, I want to repeat a call that I made last week to the chairman of this committee to bring before this committee today on this panel the head of the Capitol Police Union, who told many of us last week and has said publicly and privately that on January 6th, the rank and file members of the Capitol Police Department, the heroes that make up the men and women, the heroes that make up the Capitol Police Department, they were not prepared for what happened on January 6th in spite of intelligence reports that date back 3 weeks before that day. They weren't equipped on January 6th with the proper equipment that they needed to handle what happened that day. And they weren't trained for what was going to happen that day. As the Senate investigation report, a bipartisan report, already identified, there was a systemic breakdown of security, a lack of leadership at the very top of the United States Capitol Police who report and who Nancy Pelosi is ultimately responsible for that lack of leadership. That's where this committee should go if it's serious about making sure that something like this never happens again. Bring the head of the United States Capitol Police Union to sit on the panel today to provide a different perspective than the cherry-picked narrative that Nancy Pelosi wants the American people to hear. I repeat that call. I hope that the Democrats will think better of what they've already rejected the head of the Capitol Police Union. I hope they think better of it. Bring him before the panel today. Give him a chance to testify before the American people. Thank you. I'll defer to Representative Jordan.
Why don't the Democrats want to get to the truth? Why don't they want to answer the fundamental question, which is why wasn't there a better security posture on that day? Let me just read from a news account from February of this year. Pelosi's office had previously impressed upon the Sergeant of Arms, Paul Irving, that the National Guard was to remain off Capitol grounds. Irving told House administration the discussion centered around the, quote, optics. Why were the Democrats so concerned about the optics? Why were they so concerned about how it would look? Because what happened last summer? It's all driven by what happened last summer, where Democrats normalized anarchy, normalized political violence, raised bail money for the very rioters and looters who destroyed small businesses, attacked innocent civilians, and maybe most importantly, attacked police officers. When you spend a year talking about defunding the police and actually defund the police, it's kind of hard to have more police here on January 6th like they should have done. That's the fundamental question. That's why this thing has turned into such a political charade. The police officers who will testify today, and frankly all Capitol Hill police officers, deserve to have more help that day. But the Democrats couldn't do it because of the political position they had taken all throughout last year. That's the fundamental question that won't be answered. That's why Republicans aren't serving on this committee. And now I want to yield to the ranking member of the House administration, Mr. Davis.
When Leader McCarthy asked me to be ranking member on the House Administration Committee in the last Congress, he told me to fix things around this Capitol, which is why, as he mentioned, we introduced the Capitol Police Advancement Act during the last Congress that would have increased transparency and accountability through semi-annual reports and addressing many of the issues that have been brought up for years in IG reports, GAO studies, and other different forms of communication with Congress. The Democrats chose not to advance our legislation to help our officers. And it's with great disappointment today that I don't get to question my friend Harry Dunn. And I don't get to talk to him about what he and heroes like David Bailey and Crystal Griner, officers that saved the lives of Steve and all of us on a baseball field a few years ago. We don't get to ask the questions that will lead to why there was not a better security posture here on the Capitol complex. Harry is a friend. Harry and I hugged each other when we saw each other in the Capitol after what happened on January 6th. Harry has been to my office to talk about these issues. He knows that all of us here want to address the institutional problems with the structure that is set up to fail. The structure here in the United States Capitol is that the chief of police cannot make a final security decision without going to political appointees that make up the Capitol Police Board, his or her bosses. They can't get the security posture where they think it is up to par before they have to go to political appointees. We tried to fix this over the last few years, and the Democrats have stopped us every single step of the way. Now, if Speaker Pelosi thought that by vetoing Ranking Member Banks and Ranking Member Jordan from this committee that she would avoid the tough questions, well, she doesn't know the rest of us that well. And frankly, some of the questions that I think need to be asked of the Speaker, and I hope all of you that are in front of us today asked these questions. On January 6th at 1:43, Speaker Pelosi was passed a note while in the Speaker's chair on the House floor, requesting permission to seek support from the National Guard from then Sergeant-at-Arms Paul Irving, who was appointed by the Speaker and then subsequently fired that day by the Speaker. This is an account that has been confirmed by the Speaker's office. Why was the Speaker's permission even needed? By this time, pipe bombs had already been found outside the RNC and the DNC, and rioters had breached the steps. If Sergeant-at-Arms Irving felt he needed the Speaker's approval then, what were the instructions and conversations he had with the Speaker's office prior to January 6th? Former Capitol Police Chief Steve Sund has testified that Irving was concerned, as many have said, about the optics. And we know that the Speaker's office was calling the shots on all of their actions on January 6th. But we don't have the details leading up to those conversations leading up to the 6th, because under the Speaker's direction, the Sergeant-at-Arms has denied our House administration official request to preserve documents and communications. I will tell you the Capitol Police followed our ask and did provide that information. What are they hiding? What is the Speaker hiding? Unfortunately, I don't believe those questions are going to be asked by this committee. And the Speaker, as we've heard throughout this press conference, is tightly controlling every single question that is coming forth. This is a committee that's supposed to get to the bottom of what happened on January 6th. And as has been noted by my colleagues, the chair of this committee has left all of the questions that I just hope you ask the Speaker off the table. Don't let that happen. Now, I'd like to turn this over now to a good friend from North Dakota, Mr. Armstrong.
I think it's important to recognize what has happened with this committee, how we're moving forward, and why it's so important. Taking Jim Banks and Jim Jordan off of this committee isn't just removing two members of the Republican conference. Jim Banks represents the largest caucus in the Republican conference. Jim Jordan is the ranking member on the Judiciary Committee. They represent millions of constituents across this country who feel like their voice has now been silenced. And so when we talk about making sure we know what happens and why it will never happen again, we also have to remember for the last 6 months, people haven't been able to come here because of it. For much of that time, we had National Guard soldiers on the ground. These grounds were protected by fencing and razor wire. This is more important than what we're doing here and what we're doing. We have to make sure that never happens again. We have to protect the people who work here. We have to protect the press who covers this place. We have to protect our law enforcement. We have to protect our staff. And we have to do it in a way where the American people still have access to the people's house. And you simply cannot do that with a partisan hearing by silencing the voices of millions of American voters. And that's exactly what happened. And that's why we're so angry, frustrated, and upset right now. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Sheriff Nehls.
Thank you. I said last week that I would put my 30 years of law enforcement experience, including 8 years as sheriff, to review the Senate report in detail. And I found some things that were alarming. Specifically as it relates to the intelligence the Capitol Police had in their possession the days and weeks leading up to January 6th. Intelligence that said there was a strong likelihood of violence, that violent extremist groups were sharing detailed maps of the Capitol tunnels and encouraging supporters to bring weapons to the Capitol. Capitol Police leadership had this intelligence in their possession and somehow were caught completely off guard. The Senate report highlights the intelligence failures, but doesn't speak specifically to who in the Capitol Police knew what and when. And we must answer those questions. In addition to the intelligence failures, the Senate report highlights the clear delay of the National Guard in assisting the Capitol Police. I was alarmed to find that the Capitol Police Chief, the Chief of Police, doesn't have the authority to request National Guard support without approval of the Capitol Police Board. And the Capitol Police Board is made up of the House Sergeant at Arms and Senate Sergeant at Arms. Before the National Guard can be called, they both must agree. The House Sergeant at Arms answers to Nancy Pelosi, and it's been suggested the day of January 6th, he was waiting for Speaker Pelosi's approval before calling in the National Guard. It's interesting because the Sergeant at Arms, Paul Irving, has been uncooperative with the committees. He won't share phone records. He won't turn over emails. What is he hiding? What is Speaker Pelosi hiding? Speaker Pelosi went the extra mile to hide the truth by taking the historic steps of rejecting two of the minority leaders' select committee picks, destroying any chance for bipartisanship. This committee is completely partisan from top to bottom. Every member was chosen by Speaker Pelosi. And why? Because Speaker Pelosi wants her narrative and her outcome to prevail, and not the truth. The only so-called Republicans on the committee are on the committee to grandstand and attack the former president because of their own personal vendettas. Those Pelosi Republicans aren't interested in the truth. They're interested in getting even. Today, Leader McCarthy whipped Scalise and all of us up here. However, we're interested in the truth. We're going to continue seeking it and following the evidence no matter where it leads, because we owe it to the American people to ensure this never, ever happens again. Thank you.
Thank you, Sheriff. As you see, on the committee today, they don't have any law enforcement. We asked for 5 members, just as every time in every Congress, to represent, to ask the questions. Never before in the history of Congress has a speaker taken the unprecedented move of denying the other party to a committee of who they selected. It raises many questions. The worst part of all of this, we want to make sure this never happens again. January 6th should have never happened. The Capitol Police should not have been put in this position. They should have been able to have the resources, the training, the equipment. They shouldn't be locked in a bus away. We should not have a sergeant of arms that waits to ask for a political answer when it comes for the need of reinforcements, especially when you knew for weeks in advance. But how do you start a committee when a committee chair says everything's open except the Speaker's office, and then the Speaker denies who could be on the committee, predetermined a report that's probably already written? We want to get to the bottom of this. Take all the questions, make sure the questions are answered, and get to a solution. With that, I'll take some questions. Yes, ma'am.
So you all in different iterations said that the Speaker's trying to cover up what happened on January 6th, but she didn't say the election was stolen. She didn't call her supporters here to the Capitol. So in what role are you trying to cover up what the former president's role was on January 6th?
Nothing. We're not predetermining any questions. We'd like to be on the committee to ask them. You've got a committee chair that questioned the election of George Bush. You've got a committee chair of this who was suing the president. You've got a committee chair of this who believes Republican senators are equal to terrorists and they should be on the terrorist watch list. You've got a member of Raskin, before the president was even sworn in, said he should be impeached, who questioned the election before and objected to the electors there. You've got an Adam Schiff who we know is playing nothing but politics, lied to the American public that he had proof, took this country through an unbelievable false impeachment to find out that he lied to us. And the idea that she thinks these predetermined people will protect her, I think it should start off with everybody should be able to ask the questions. Let's get to the bottom of this. This should never happen again. When the Kavanaugh hearings took place, there was a break in the line of the Capitol Police. They are the majority party. Why didn't they take from that to be prepared for any other time coming forward? You've got a House administration that oversees a great deal of this. You had a chairman of that committee that had not been to Washington since May. You had IG reports that told you were ill-prepared, the Capitol Police. Why would you damage the men and women that we've watched time and again put their life on the line? To go into the line of fire, you have Steve Scalise, Rodney Davis here that was on that baseball field. Why wouldn't we make that commitment to them? You have Rodney Davis, who offered legislation as the ranking member in the minority that the majority would never bring up, even though the IG reports and others said it needed. Are those questions going to be asked? Are we going to be back at this situation again in the future? Two questions for this entire committee should be, why were we so ill-prepared for that day? And how can we make sure this never happens again? And that's what should drive the committee. There may be buildup before that day that you're going to have to investigate. Speaker Pelosi worked 6 months trying to make sure that would never happen. We had an officer killed on Good Friday, just across here, based upon, if you listen to who made the killing of buying the knife and go out, it was politically motivated, but we're not going to investigate that. You have the FBI doing investigations. You want to make sure nothing in this committee gets in the way of that. You have an architect of the Capitol that has been appropriated $10 million to make sure this is better prepared. Why wouldn't we then ask the tough questions and make sure the Capitol Police have the resources, the training, and the equipment? That is what's being withheld, and that's what we complain about.
Leader McConnell,
yes.
A week after the insurrection, you said that Trump was partially responsible for what happened. Do you still stand by that?
I think from a standpoint, I'm looking at all the investigation as we go forward. I would have liked response faster. Having known what I know today, that you just listened to Rodney Davis. Why would a sergeant of arms, when you have an insurrection going on, or protest out here, you got a line being broken, and you're the sergeant of arms, why would your first response be, I got to send a note to the speaker to see if it's okay if I can do my job to protect the men and women on the line? Why would that be your first reaction? Why? I don't think any of us knew that. Do you realize that the sergeant of arms, as being the leader of the Republicans, never talked to me prior coming up to the 16th, even though they knew on December 14th? How many meetings did they have with the Speaker's office for the preparation? He never passed me a note that day. I would tell you, bring the National Guard. There are people out there who say there were phone calls to the Speaker that offered the National Guard prior to that day and was turned down. And being turned down, and you have to ask the Speaker on the day of what was going on? Why wouldn't you do your job? Why would you feel that in your job you couldn't make the decision? You were the officer. We have a sheriff for more than 30 years. I promise you this. In his capacity when he was sheriff, he did not think he had to call an elected official for anything for law enforcement that was going on. He knew his men and women were out there, and he needed to defend them. And he wanted to make sure they were prepared. That's why we want people in questions like that asked. Yes?
Leader McCarthy, a lot of people, Representative Armstrong said that by not allowing Jim Banks or Jim Jordan on the committee, they're silencing millions of Americans. But aren't by pulling all of your members from the committee, aren't you preventing those real legitimate questions from being asked? And
no.
do you think that the Democrats are being honest from counteracting some of those things?
No. What you want is, the one thing we have in our government, you don't get 100% of what you want. You have to find compromise. This is the only situation in the history of a select committee by a speaker to try to predetermine what could be asked and what the results could take place. She has fought this for 6 months. At the same time of those 6 months, 2 committees in the Senate, bipartisan, has done an investigation. And then when we came to this solution, partisan-based, and we offered no subpoena power, 5 members, never in the history of Congress has this taken place. Why? Why would that take place? And I think from the perspective, you've got a ranking member of the Judiciary Committee, they could have oversight to part of this. You've got Jim Banks running the largest caucus inside the conference, served our nation in Afghanistan in the Navy, and she questions the outcome of that. When you've got a committee chair that objected to the election of George Bush, It believes Republican senators should be on the terrorist watch list, was actually suing President Trump at the time. What we're objecting to is that we're not going to find the solutions. We want to find the solutions that this would never happen again. That's all we've asked for. Thank you very much. Have a good day.
Why not question McConnell's role? He appointed Michael Stinger. He's part of the Capitol Police Board.